Blackwells True North, Washington, D.C., 1923. Rose Kensington sat before the fireplace, lost in thought. Then, in the flickering flames, a shape formed broad shoulders, a strong jaw, eyes she had loved. Captain Thomas Sinclair. She reached forward, and the fire flared, his silhouette vanishing in the heat. Chapter 1. The shadow in the firelight. The fire crackled, a restless orange beast in the hearth, mirroring the turmoil within Rose Kensington. It was 1923, 5 years since the guns had fallen silent, 5 years since the telegram had arrived, shattering the carefully constructed facade of her life. Washington, D.C. had moved on, embraced the roaring 20s with a desperate gaiety, but Rose remained tethered to the past, a ghost haunting the grand halls of her Georgetown home. The house itself was a relic of a bygone era, a stately brick mansion filled with heavy mahogany furniture and portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Rose, at 58, felt like a relic herself, a woman out of time. Her once vibrant auburn hair, now streaked with silver, was pulled back in a severe bun, accentuating the sharp angles of her face, the lines etched by grief and sleepless nights. Her eyes, once a sparkling hazel, were now clouded with a perpetual melancholy, reflecting the endless reel of memories that played behind them. Tonight, the fire seemed to hold a particular fascination. Or perhaps, it was the shadows dancing within the flames. They coalesced, shifted, forming a familiar silhouette, broad shoulders, a strong, determined jawline, and eyes that had once held the warmth of 1,000 suns. Captain Thomas Sinclair. The name echoed in the silent room, a phantom whisper from a life she had desperately tried to bury. She reached a hand towards the flickering image, her fingers trembling. The fire flared, a sudden burst of heat, and the vision vanished, leaving only the dancing flames and the lingering scent of wood smoke. Rose pulled her hand back, a sharp intake of breath escaping her lips. It had been so real, so achingly familiar. For a fleeting moment, she had felt the phantom brush of his hand against hers, the ghost of his warm breath on her cheek. These visions, these hallucinations, had become more frequent lately. At first, she had dismissed them as the product of grief, the desperate yearning of a heart unwilling to let go. But their intensity, their vividness, had begun to unsettle her. Was she losing her mind? Was this the price of clinging to a past that could never be reclaimed? Rose had met Thomas Sinclair during the war, in 1917. She had been a volunteer nurse, driven by a patriotic fervor and a desperate need to escape the suffocating confines of her privileged life. He had been a captain in the American Expeditionary Forces, a man forged in the crucible of the trenches, his spirit tempered by the horrors he had witnessed. Their connection had been immediate, a spark ignited in the darkness of a world consumed by war. He had been everything her arranged fiancé, the wealthy and influential Senator Harrison Caldwell, was not. Thomas was raw, honest, his emotions laid bare, his heart worn on his sleeve, despite the uniform that tried to contain him. Harrison was polished, predictable, his affections as carefully calculated as his political maneuvers. With Thomas, she had felt alive, truly alive, for the first time in her life. Their love had blossomed in the shadow of death, a fragile flower pushing through the cracked earth of a battlefield. They had stolen moments together, snatched from the jaws of war. Brief encounters in candlelit field hospitals, whispered conversations over the crackling sound of gunfire, stolen kisses in the bombed-out ruins of a French village. Each moment had been precious, a treasure to be hoarded against the ever-present threat of loss. He used to joke he had the trenches to thank for introducing him to her. The mud and blood brought them together. Then the telegram had arrived. Missing in action, presumed deceased. The words had been stark, brutal, devoid of any comfort. The world had tilted on its axis, the vibrant colors of her life fading to a dull, lifeless gray. Harrison had been there, of course, offering his condolences, his support, his ever-present, suffocating presence. He had stepped back into the role of fiancé with an ease that had chilled Rose to the bone. She had married him, of course. It was expected, the proper thing to do. A war widow, especially one of her social standing, needed the security and stability that only a man like Harrison could provide. She had played the part of the dutiful wife, attending endless political functions, smiling on cue, her inner self slowly withering away. But the memories of Thomas remained, locked away in a secret compartment of her heart, a flickering flame that refused to be extinguished. And now, 5 years later, that flame was burning brighter than ever, threatening to consume her entirely. Rose rose from her chair, her movements stiff and deliberate. She walked over to a small, antique writing desk tucked away in a corner of the room. The desk had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who, according to family lore, had harbored a secret love of her own. Rose had always felt a kinship with her grandmother, a shared understanding of the hidden depths that lay beneath the surface of a seemingly placid life. She opened the desk drawer, revealing a jumble of old letters, photographs, and trinkets. Beneath a stack of yellowed correspondence, she found what she was looking for: a small, leather-bound box. Her fingers traced the worn edges of the box, the leather soft and supple beneath her touch. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a collection of mementos, each one a tangible link to the past. There was a dried flower, a pressed poppy from a field in France, a faded photograph of Thomas, his smile boyish and carefree, his eyes full of a light that had long since been extinguished, a small, silver locket, engraved with their initials RK. TS. And finally, a bundle of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. These were the letters Thomas had written to her from the front, his words filled with love, longing, and the grim realities of war. Rose picked up the locket, her thumb caressing the engraved initials. She opened it, revealing 2 miniature portraits. One was of her, taken before the war, her face young and unlined, her eyes full of a naive optimism. The other was of Thomas, a more formal portrait, taken in his uniform, his gaze steady and resolute. She closed the locket, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. The weight of the past, the burden of her secrets, pressed down on her, suffocating her. She needed to understand, to unravel the mystery that had haunted her for 5 years. Was Thomas truly dead? Or was there something more, something that the telegram had failed to reveal? The intensity of the vision, the feeling of his presence, it couldn't all be in her head. There had to be something more she was not seeing. The fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers in the hearth. But the shadow of Thomas Sinclair remained, a persistent presence in the room, a silent challenge to the life she had built in his absence. Chapter 2. Whispers of Ypres. The chill of the late October evening seeped into Rose's bones, despite the thick Persian rug beneath her feet and the heavy velvet drapes drawn against the night. The embers in the fireplace had faded to a dull red glow, casting long, dancing shadows across the room, each one a potential phantom of Thomas. She clutched the locket tighter, its cold metal a small comfort against the overwhelming tide of memories. Rose decided she needed air, a respite from the suffocating atmosphere of her own thoughts. She wrapped a thick woolen shawl around her shoulders and stepped out onto the balcony that overlooked the sprawling gardens of her Georgetown estate. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of burning leaves from a distant bonfire. The moon, a sliver of silver in the inky sky, cast a pale, ethereal light over the landscape. Below, the city of Washington, D.C. glittered with 1,000 points of light, a vibrant tapestry of life and activity. But Rose felt disconnected from it all, an outsider looking in. The war had changed her, irrevocably. It had stripped away her innocence, her illusions, leaving her with a profound sense of loss and a lingering unease that she couldn't quite shake. The name Ypres whispered on the wind, a chilling reminder of the telegram. Ypres, the infamous battleground in Belgium, a place synonymous with death and destruction. It was there, according to the official report, that Thomas had fallen. A shell had exploded near his position, leaving no trace. No body, no identification, just nothingness. Rose had never fully accepted that explanation. It was too neat, too convenient. There had been no closure, no opportunity to say goodbye. Just a gaping void where his presence had once been. And in that void, doubt had taken root, festering like a wound that refused to heal. She leaned against the cold stone railing of the balcony, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. She remembered a conversation she had had with Thomas, just weeks before he had been deployed to Ypres. They had been sitting in a small, makeshift hospital tent, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and the moans of wounded soldiers. "Promise me something, Rose," he had said, his voice low and urgent. He'd taken her hand, his grip surprisingly strong despite the bandages wrapped around his forearm, a fresh wound from a sniper's bullet. "Anything, Thomas," she had replied, her heart aching with the knowledge that their time together was fleeting. "If anything happens to me if I don't come back, don't believe everything they tell you. There are secrets that can't be revealed in official reports. There are things that some men would prefer stay hidden, including some of my superiors." He squeezed her hand. "Trust your instincts, Rose. You have a strong spirit, a keen mind. Don't let them bury the truth along with me." At the time, she had dismissed his words as the ramblings of a man facing his own mortality. The paranoia of war, she had thought. But now, 5 years later, his words echoed in her mind with a chilling resonance. What secrets had he been referring to? What truth was he afraid would be buried? Rose had tried, in the immediate aftermath of the telegram, to investigate further. She had contacted the War Department, written letters to Thomas's commanding officer, even attempted to reach out to some of the soldiers who had served alongside him. But her efforts had been met with stonewalling, bureaucratic red tape, and carefully worded responses that revealed nothing of substance. Harrison, of course, had discouraged her inquiries. "It's best to let it go, Rose," he had said, his voice smooth and patronizing. "Dwelling on the past will only bring you more pain. Thomas is gone. You need to move on. Focus on the future, our future." She had resented his interference, his attempts to control her grief, to steer her towards a future she didn't want. But she had been too emotionally drained, too vulnerable, to fight him. She had retreated into herself, burying her doubts and suspicions beneath a layer of polite acquiescence. But now, the vision in the firelight, the renewed intensity of her memories, had awakened something within her. A flicker of defiance, a spark of determination. She couldn't ignore the whispers any longer. She owed it to Thomas, to herself, to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves in the garden below. Rose shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her. She knew that her quest would be difficult, dangerous even. She was a woman alone, navigating a world dominated by men, a world where secrets were closely guarded and the truth was often a casualty of war. But she was no longer the naive, sheltered woman she had been before the war. The trenches, the hospitals, the constant presence of death had forged her into something stronger, more resilient. She had witnessed the best and the worst of humanity, and she had learned to trust her instincts, to rely on her own inner strength. She still had the strength Thomas saw. As she stood there on the balcony, gazing out at the city lights, Rose made a decision. She would reopen the investigation into Thomas's disappearance. She would follow the whispers of Ypres, wherever they might lead. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. A newfound determination settled within her, a cold fire replacing the lingering embers of grief. The journey would be long and arduous, but she was ready to face it, for Thomas and for herself. The first step, she decided, would be to revisit those carefully stored away items in her grandmother's trunk. Perhaps a clue lay hidden there unnoticed for all these years. She turned back to the house, the shadows no longer frightening, but a comforting reminder of the man she had loved and the mystery she was determined to solve. Chapter 3. The Telegram's Sting. The telegram itself was still there, tucked inside the leather box, nestled between a faded photograph of Thomas and a dried sprig of lavender. Rose unfolded it carefully, the thin paper brittle with age, the edges frayed. The words, stark and black against the yellowed background, still held the power to wound, to send a fresh wave of grief washing over her. Western Union Mrs. Harrison Caldwell, formerly Miss Rose Kensington, redacted Georgetown, Washington, D.C. Regret to inform you Captain Thomas Sinclair, missing in action, presumed deceased, vicinity of Ypres, October 27, 1918. Stop. Further details to follow. Stop. Deepest sympathies. Stop. War Department. Stop. Rose traced the words with her fingertip, each syllable a sharp, stabbing pain. Further details to follow. That had been the promise, the cruel, empty promise that had kept her clinging to a sliver of hope for months, even years, after the war had ended. But the details had never arrived. Just silence. A deafening, suffocating silence. She remembered the day the telegram had arrived. It had been a crisp autumn afternoon, much like this one. She had been arranging flowers in the drawing room, preparing for a dinner party that Harrison was hosting for some of his political colleagues. The doorbell had rung, and the maid had appeared, her face pale and drawn, holding the telegram in her trembling hand. Rose had known, even before she had opened it, that it was bad news. A sense of dread, a cold premonition, had settled over her. She had torn open the envelope, her fingers fumbling with the thin paper. The words had leaped out at her, blurring before her eyes. She had read them again and again, each time the impact hitting her with the force of a physical blow. The room had started to spin, the vibrant colors of the flowers fading to a dull, monochrome gray. She had crumpled to the floor, the telegram clutched in her hand, a silent scream building in her throat. Harrison had found her there, moments later. He had been the epitome of composure, his voice calm and controlled, his expression one of carefully modulated concern. He had helped her to a chair, poured her a glass of brandy, and summoned the doctor. "It's a terrible tragedy, Rose," he had said, his hand resting on her arm, his touch strangely cold and impersonal. "But you must be strong. You have a duty to yourself, to your family, to me." His words had grated on her, his emphasis on duty, on appearances, even in the face of such devastating loss. She had wanted to lash out at him, to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all. But she had remained silent, her grief bottled up inside her, a toxic brew of sorrow and resentment. The following days had passed in a blur. There had been condolences, visits from friends and family, the endless rituals of mourning. Rose had gone through the motions, playing the part of the grieving fiancé, her inner self numb and detached. She had clung to the hope that the telegram was wrong, that Thomas was still alive, that he would somehow find his way back to her. She had spent hours poring over maps of Belgium, studying the reports of the fighting around Ypres, searching for any clue, any sign that he might have survived. But the reality had slowly sunk in. Thomas was gone. The vibrant, passionate man she had loved had been swallowed up by the war, leaving behind only a void, a gaping hole in her life. She was going through the motions of planning a life with Harrison while she was fighting every fiber of her being that wanted to keep looking. Rose refolded the telegram, placing it back in the leather box. The sting of the words was still fresh, the pain as raw as it had been 5 years ago. But now, there was something else mixed with the grief. A flicker of anger, a spark of determination. She picked up the photograph of Thomas, the one taken in his uniform. His eyes, so full of life and intelligence, seemed to gaze directly at her, a silent challenge across the years. She remembered the promise she had made to him, the promise to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. She closed the box, a new resolve hardening within her. The telegram was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning. It was the catalyst that had set her on this path, the path to uncovering the secrets of Ypres, the truth about Thomas's disappearance. The telegram, she realized with a surge of bitter clarity, was not a message of death, but a coded message of its own. A message she was finally ready to decipher. She would start by retracing her steps, re-examining every detail, every conversation, every clue that she had dismissed or overlooked in the past. The answer, she was convinced, lay hidden somewhere in the shadows of her memory, waiting to be brought to light. And she was determined to start at the very beginning. The day the telegram arrived. She would meticulously reconstruct that day, and the days that followed, hoping to find a thread, a glimmer of something that would lead her to the truth. Chapter 4. A Suitcase of Secrets. The attic was a cavernous space, filled with the detritus of generations. Dust motes danced in the faint light that filtered through the grimy windows, illuminating stacks of forgotten furniture, moth-eaten tapestries, and boxes overflowing with old clothes, books, and papers. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, a testament to the passage of time and the slow, inexorable process of disintegration. Rose navigated the cluttered space with a flashlight, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She was searching for a particular suitcase, a large, leather-bound trunk that had belonged to Thomas. He had left it with her, just before he had been deployed overseas, with instructions to keep it safe until his return. It contained some personal belongings, he had said, his voice casual, but his eyes betraying a hint of anxiety. Nothing of any real value, just sentimental things. I'd rather not risk losing them in the trenches. Rose had promised to keep the suitcase safe, never imagining that it would become a repository of secrets, a tangible link to a past that she was now determined to unravel. After several minutes of searching, she found the suitcase, tucked away in a dark corner, beneath a pile of old blankets. It was heavier than she remembered, the leather worn and cracked, the brass clasps tarnished with age. She dragged it out into the open, the effort sending a sharp pain through her back. She knelt beside the suitcase, her fingers tracing the faded initials TS, embossed on the lid. A wave of emotion washed over her, a mixture of grief, longing, and a strange sense of anticipation. This suitcase, she realized, was more than just a container of personal belongings. It was a time capsule, a portal to the past, a potential key to unlocking the mystery of Thomas's disappearance. With trembling hands, she unfastened the clasps and lifted the heavy lid. The interior of the suitcase was lined with faded blue silk, the fabric frayed and torn in places. The contents were neatly arranged, a testament to Thomas's orderly military mind, even in his personal life. There were several neatly folded uniforms, their khaki fabric stiff with age, bearing the insignia of his regiment. There were boots, polished to a high sheen, despite the years of neglect. There was a shaving kit, a leather-bound journal, and a collection of books, mostly classics of literature and military history. Rose carefully examined each item, searching for anything that might offer a clue, a hint of the secrets that Thomas had hinted at. The uniforms revealed nothing unusual, just the standard attire of an American officer. The boots were well worn, but otherwise unremarkable. The shaving kit contained the usual toiletries, nothing out of the ordinary. The journal, however, piqued her interest. She opened it, her heart pounding with anticipation. The pages were filled with Thomas's neat, precise handwriting, detailing his experiences in the war. He wrote about the daily routines of trench life, the boredom, the fear, the constant threat of death. He described the camaraderie among the soldiers, the shared hardships, the unspoken bonds forged in the crucible of battle. But there were also entries that hinted at something more, something darker and more troubling. He wrote about his growing disillusionment with the war, his doubts about the official justifications for the conflict. He mentioned rumors of corruption and incompetence among the higher ranks, of decisions made for political expediency rather than military necessity. He wrote, in one entry, about a shadowy figure who seemed to be pulling the strings behind the scenes, a man with connections to powerful interests in both the American and French governments. He didn't name this figure, but he described him as dangerous and unscrupulous, a man who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. Rose read and reread these entries, her mind racing. Could this shadowy figure be connected to Thomas's disappearance? Was he the one Thomas had been referring to when he had warned her not to believe everything she was told? She continued to search through the suitcase, her fingers probing every pocket, every crevice. Beneath a stack of letters from home, she found a small, wooden box hidden inside a hollowed-out book. Her heart skipped a beat. This was something new, something she hadn't seen before. She opened the box, revealing a collection of photographs, documents, and a single, sealed envelope. The photographs were mostly of Thomas and his fellow soldiers, taken in various locations, both in training and in the field. But one photograph caught her attention. It showed Thomas standing next to a man she didn't recognize, a tall, imposing figure in a dark suit, his face partially obscured by the shadow of a hat. Rose turned the photograph over. On the back, in Thomas's handwriting, was a single word: Viridian. The documents were even more intriguing. They appear to be copies of official military reports, intelligence briefings, and coded messages. Rose couldn't understand most of the content, but she recognized some of the names and locations mentioned. They were all connected to the area around Ypres, the place where Thomas had disappeared. Finally, she picked up the sealed envelope. It was addressed to her, in Thomas's handwriting. Her name, Rose Kensington, written in a strong, familiar script. Her hands trembled as she carefully opened the envelope, her heart pounding in her chest. This, she knew, was it. This was the message from the past, the key to unlocking the mystery. The letter felt heavy in her hands, the weight of 5 years of unanswered questions pressing down on her. She hesitated, a sudden wave of fear washing over her. What if the truth was too painful to bear? What if it shattered the image of Thomas she had carried in her heart for so long? But she knew she couldn't turn back. She had come too far. She took a deep breath and began to unfold the letter, the paper crackling softly in the silence of the attic. Chapter 5. The Officer's Ball. The letter was dated October 20th, 1918, just a week before Thomas was reported missing. The ink was slightly faded, but his handwriting was as clear and decisive as she remembered. My dearest Rose, I write this letter with a heavy heart, knowing that I may not have the opportunity to speak to you again. The situation here is deteriorating rapidly. The fighting around Ypres is intensifying, and the casualties are mounting. But it's not just the fighting that troubles me. There are things happening here, Rose, things that I can't explain in detail, things that make me fear for my safety and for the safety of others. I know this sounds cryptic, but I can't risk putting anything in writing that could fall into the wrong hands. There are eyes and ears everywhere, even among those we trust. But I need you to know this. If anything happens to me, don't believe the official story. Don't accept their explanations. There's more to this war than meets the eye, and I fear that I've stumbled upon something dangerous. The photograph I enclosed, the one with the man named Viridian, he is the key. He is connected to everything. He is the one you need to investigate. I don't know his real identity, but I know that he is powerful, influential, and utterly ruthless. He operates in the shadows, pulling the strings, manipulating events to his own advantage. I know this is a lot to ask, Rose, but I trust you. I trust your intelligence, your courage, your unwavering sense of justice. You are the only one who can uncover the truth, the only one who can bring these men to justice. Please, don't let my death be in vain. I love you, Rose, more than words can express. You have given me a glimpse of happiness in this hellish world, a reason to fight, a reason to hope. If I don't make it back, know that my last thoughts will be of you. Yours always and forever. Thomas. Rose read the letter several times, her emotions a whirlwind of grief, anger, and a growing sense of determination. Thomas's words confirmed her suspicions, validated her doubts. He had been caught up in something far more sinister than a simple battlefield casualty. He had uncovered a conspiracy, a web of deceit that reached the highest levels of power. The name Viridian echoed in her mind. Who was this man? What was his connection to Thomas's disappearance? She knew that finding him would be like searching for a needle in a haystack, a dangerous and potentially futile endeavor. But she had promised Thomas, and she would not break her vow. She looked again at the photograph. The man in the dark suit, his face obscured by shadow, exuded an aura of power and menace. He was a ghost, a phantom, a figure who operated in the darkness, pulling the strings of war and death. Rose decided to start her investigation by focusing on the events leading up to Thomas's deployment to Ypres. She remembered that there had been an officer's ball, a lavish affair held at a grand hotel in Washington, D.C., just a few weeks before he had shipped out. It had been a glittering occasion, filled with champagne, music, and the nervous gaiety of men preparing to face the horrors of war. Rose had attended the ball with Harrison, of course. He had been in his element, surrounded by his political cronies, basking in the admiration of his peers. Rose had felt like an outsider, a decorative accessory on his arm, her presence required but largely ignored. She remembered seeing Thomas there, across the crowded ballroom. He had been standing alone, near the edge of the dance floor, his gaze fixed on her. He had looked different somehow. There had been a sadness in his eyes, a weariness that she hadn't seen before. They hadn't been able to speak, not really. Harrison had kept a close watch on her, steering her away from any potential inconveniences. But Thomas had managed to catch her eye for a brief, fleeting moment. And in that moment, she had seen a silent plea, a desperate message that she hadn't understood at the time. Now, recalling the ball in greater detail, she also realized she may have seen Viridian there, though she couldn't be sure. She had a vague memory of a tall, dark-haired man in a finely tailored suit, standing near the bar, engaged in a hushed conversation with a group of military officials. He had seemed aloof, detached from the revelry around him, his expression one of cold calculation. Had it been him? Rose decided to start her investigation by revisiting the guest list for the officers' ball. She knew that Harrison kept meticulous records of all his social engagements, including detailed lists of attendees. Somewhere in those records, she might find a clue, a connection to Viridian, a starting point for her search. She would need to be discreet, of course. Harrison would never approve of her digging into the past, especially if it involved questioning the official narrative of the war. She needed a plan, a way to access those records without arousing his suspicion. She knew the layout of the house intimately. Where Harrison kept his office, his safe. Getting the guest list wouldn't be easy, but she was confident she could find a way. The ball, she felt, held a key. A key not just to Viridian, but perhaps to the entire conspiracy. The memory of Thomas's pleading gaze across the ballroom floor spurred her on. She would start there, in the glittering, deceptive world of the officers' ball, and follow the trail of secrets wherever it might lead. Chapter 6. The Frenchman's Warning. Accessing Harrison's office was easier than Rose had anticipated. He was, as always, predictable in his routines. Every Wednesday evening, he attended a poker game with a group of his Senate colleagues, a ritual that lasted late into the night. This Wednesday would be no different. Rose waited until she heard the heavy front door close, the sound of his chauffeur-driven car pulling away from the curb. She gave him an hour's grace to ensure he was well and truly ensconced in his game before making her move. She slipped down the grand staircase, her heart pounding in her chest, the silence of the house amplifying every creak and groan of the old building. She was dressed in a simple, dark-colored dress, her hair pulled back tightly, her movements swift and silent. She felt like a spy in her own home, a stranger in a life that had never truly been hers. Harrison's office was located on the ground floor at the rear of the house, overlooking the gardens. It was a large, imposing room, filled with heavy mahogany furniture, leather-bound books, and the ever-present scent of cigar smoke. A large, ornate desk dominated the center of the room, its surface cluttered with papers, files, and political paraphernalia. Rose knew that the guest list she was looking for would likely be kept in one of the locked drawers of the desk, or possibly in the small, wall-mounted safe that was concealed behind a portrait of Harrison's grandfather. She had brought with her a small set of lock-picking tools, a skill she had learned from a rather unconventional friend during the war, a woman who had worked as a nurse alongside her, but who had also, it turned out, been a highly skilled operative for the French resistance. She started with the desk drawers, working quickly and efficiently, her fingers nimble and practiced. The locks were relatively simple, and she had them open in a matter of minutes. She searched through the contents of each drawer, sifting through piles of correspondence, financial statements, and political documents. But there was no sign of the guest list. Next, she turned her attention to the safe. This was a more challenging proposition. The safe was old, but sturdy, with a complex combination lock. Rose examined the mechanism closely, her fingers tracing the intricate workings. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and tried to recall the lessons she had learned from her French friend. "It's all about feel, Rose," the woman had said, her voice a low, husky whisper. "You have to listen to the tumblers, feel the vibrations, sense the moment when the lock is ready to yield." Rose applied gentle pressure to the dial, turning it slowly, listening intently for the subtle clicks and whispers of the internal mechanism. Her heart was pounding, her palms sweating, but she forced herself to remain calm, focused. She visualized the internal workings of the lock, imagining the tumblers falling into place, one by one. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, she felt a slight shift, a subtle give in the mechanism. She held her breath, applied a final, delicate twist, and heard a satisfying click. The safe door swung open. Inside, she found a collection of documents, neatly organized in labeled folders. She scanned the labels, her heart skipping a beat when she saw one marked Social Engagements 1918. She pulled out the folder, her hands trembling with anticipation. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the lists of names, dates, and locations. And then she found it. The guest list for the officers' ball, held on October 5th, 1918, at the Willard Hotel. She quickly scanned the list, her eyes searching for the name Viridian. But it wasn't there. She reread the list, more slowly this time, checking every name, every entry. Still nothing. Disappointment washed over her. Had she been wrong? Was Viridian a figment of Thomas's imagination, a code name for something else entirely? But then, she noticed something else. At the bottom of the list, in a separate section marked Special Guests, there was a single name, followed by a brief description. Monsieur Dubois, French military liaison. Rose frowned. She didn't remember seeing anyone named Dubois at the ball. But the description, French military liaison, intrigued her. It was possible that Dubois was a pseudonym, a cover name for Viridian. The French were known for their intricate intelligence networks, their penchant for secrecy and deception. She remembered, suddenly, a conversation she had overheard at the ball, a brief exchange between Harrison and another senator, a man named Caldwell, no relation. They had been discussing the war effort, the need for closer cooperation between the American and French forces. "The French are being difficult," Harrison had said, his voice low and irritated. "They're holding back information, refusing to share intelligence. We need to find a way to persuade them." Caldwell had replied, "I've heard that they've sent a new liaison officer to Washington, a man named Dubois. He's supposed to be quite influential. Perhaps we should try to cultivate him." Rose had dismissed the conversation at the time as just another example of political maneuvering. But now it took on a new significance. Could this Monsieur Dubois be Viridian? Was he the shadowy figure that Thomas had warned her about? She decided to investigate further. She knew that the French embassy was located just a few blocks from her home. It wouldn't be easy to get information about a French military liaison, especially one who might be operating under a false name. But she had to try. As she was about to close the safe, she noticed a small, folded piece of paper tucked away in the back corner. She pulled it out, unfolding it carefully. It was a handwritten note, in Harrison's scrawling script. Dubois Hotel, Lafayette, Room 312.
Urgent.
Discreet. Rose's heart leaped. This was it. This was the connection she had been looking for. The note confirmed her suspicion that Dubois was more than just a military liaison. He was someone Harrison considered important enough to warrant a secret meeting in a discreet location. She carefully replaced the note, closed the safe, and relocked the desk drawers. She had what she needed. She had a name, a location, and a starting point for her investigation. As she crept back out of Harrison's office, a plan began to form in her mind. She would visit the Hotel Lafayette, pose as a potential guest, and try to gather information about Monsieur Dubois. She knew it was a risky move, but she was running out of options. She had to find Viridian, and she had to do it soon. She left, a sense of urgency washing over, mixed with a strange, growing unease. The note, simple though it seemed, felt like a warning.
Urgent.
Discreet. The words seemed to whisper of danger, of hidden threats lurking in the shadows. Chapter 7. Echoes in Georgetown. The Hotel Lafayette, in 1923, was a haven for discreet encounters, a place where secrets were whispered in dimly lit corners and clandestine meetings took place behind closed doors. It was a far cry from the grand, opulent hotels like the Willard, favored by Washington's political elite. The Lafayette catered to a different clientele, a mix of traveling businessmen, foreign dignitaries, and those who preferred to keep their affairs out of the public eye. Rose dressed carefully for her visit, choosing a stylish but unassuming outfit, a dark blue dress with a matching cloche hat and a simple string of pearls. She wanted to blend in, to appear as just another guest, someone who wouldn't attract undue attention. She took a taxi to the hotel, her nerves on edge, her mind racing with possibilities. She had concocted a story, a plausible reason for her inquiries about Monsieur Dubois. She would pretend to be a representative of a charitable organization, seeking to contact him regarding a potential donation to a fund for French war veterans. The lobby of the hotel was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of cigar smoke and expensive perfume. The decor was faded grandeur, a mix of plush velvet armchairs, heavy drapes, and ornate chandeliers that had seen better days. Rose approached the reception desk, her heart pounding in her chest. The receptionist, a bored-looking man with slicked-back hair and a weary expression, barely glanced at her as she approached. "I'm here to inquire about a guest," Rose said, her voice steady and confident, despite the tremor in her hands. "A Monsieur Dubois. I believe he's staying in room 312. The receptionist frowned, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Monsieur Dubois is not accepting visitors," he said, his voice flat and dismissive. "I understand," Rose said, maintaining her composure. "But I'm not here to visit him. I'm representing the American Aid Society for French war veterans. We're seeking to contact Monsieur Dubois regarding a potential donation to our fund. It's a matter of some urgency." The receptionist hesitated, his gaze lingering on Rose's face, assessing her credibility. She met his gaze directly, her expression calm and determined. "I can leave a message for him," he said finally, his voice grudgingly accommodating. "But I can't guarantee he'll respond." "That would be very helpful," Rose said, relieved. "Please tell him that Mrs. Caldwell is inquiring and that it's regarding a matter of significant financial benefit to his countrymen." The receptionist wrote down her name and the message, his movements slow and deliberate. Rose watched him closely, trying to gauge his reaction. Was he suspicious? Did he know more about Dubois than he was letting on? "He checks his messages regularly," the receptionist offered. He finally looked up, a sly smile playing about his lips. "Monsieur Dubois appreciates discretion." "Of course," Rose said, matching his smile. "Discretion is paramount in matters of this nature." She thanked the receptionist and turned to leave, her mind racing. She had planted the seed, but she needed more information. She decided to linger in the lobby, pretending to read a newspaper while keeping a close watch on the reception desk and the comings and goings of the hotel guests. She spent the next hour observing the scene, trying to glean any clues, any hints about Dubois and his activities. She noticed a few things that piqued her interest. Several men, dressed in dark suits and hats, entered the hotel and spoke briefly with the receptionist before heading upstairs. They had the look of government officials or perhaps intelligence agents. A young woman, elegantly dressed and carrying a small, leather briefcase, arrived and asked for room 312. The receptionist handed her a key without hesitation, and she disappeared up the stairs. Rose also noticed that the receptionist seemed to be receiving an unusually high number of phone calls, his conversations hushed and cryptic. He often glanced around the lobby, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. These observations confirmed her suspicion that room 312 was more than just a hotel room. It was a hub of activity, a meeting place for people who preferred to operate in the shadows. As she was about to leave, feeling frustrated and discouraged, she saw him. A tall, imposing man, dressed in a dark suit and hat, emerged from the elevator and approached the reception desk. He had a stern, commanding presence, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hat. But Rose recognized him instantly. It was the man from the photograph, the man Thomas had identified as Viridian. Her heart leaped into her throat. She froze, her breath catching in her chest. She watched, mesmerized, as he spoke briefly with the receptionist, his voice low and authoritative. The receptionist handed him a small, sealed envelope, and he turned and walked towards the hotel entrance. Rose knew that she had to follow him, to find out where he was going, who he was meeting. But she hesitated, her fear battling with her determination. This was a dangerous game, and she was playing with fire. But the image of Thomas, his pleading eyes, his desperate warning, flashed through her mind. She couldn't back down now. She had come too far. She owed it to him, to herself, to follow this man, to uncover the truth. She gathered her courage, took a deep breath, and followed him out of the hotel, into the bustling streets of Georgetown. The chase was on. She knew that she was stepping into a world of shadows and deceit, a world where the stakes were high and the consequences could be deadly. But she was ready. She had to be. The echoes of Thomas's voice, the whispers of Ypres, guided her steps. The man, just ahead, kept glancing behind him. She ducked into a doorway. He turned a corner. She followed, her heart pounding, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She couldn't lose him now. Chapter 8. The Cryptographer's Dilemma. Rose followed Viridian or Du Bois, as he was known at the hotel, through the labyrinthine streets of Georgetown, keeping a safe distance, her senses on high alert. The man walked briskly, his movements purposeful, his gaze constantly scanning his surroundings. He seemed to be aware that he was being followed, or at least that he was a person of interest. He led her on a winding route, past elegant townhouses, quaint shops, and bustling cafes. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the streets, making it easier for Rose to remain concealed. But the darkness also brought a heightened sense of danger, a feeling that she was stepping deeper and deeper into a treacherous world. Finally, he turned into a narrow alleyway, disappearing from view. Rose hesitated, her instincts warning her to be cautious. Alleyways were notorious for ambushes, for clandestine meetings, for all manner of illicit activities. But she couldn't afford to lose him. She took a deep breath, steeled her nerves, and followed him into the alley. It was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of garbage and decay. The walls on either side were lined with overflowing trash cans, boarded-up windows, and fire escapes that creaked ominously in the breeze. Rose kept to the shadows, her footsteps silent on the cobblestone pavement. She saw him ahead, standing in front of a nondescript door, halfway down the alley. He knocked on the door in a specific pattern, a series of short and long raps. A moment later, the door opened a crack, and a pair of eyes peered out. A brief, hushed conversation ensued, and then the door opened wider, allowing him to enter. Rose crept closer, her heart pounding in her chest. She needed to find out what was going on behind that door, who he was meeting, what secrets were being exchanged. She noticed a small, barred window, high up on the wall, near the door. It was grimy and covered with cobwebs, but it offered a potential vantage point. She looked around, searching for something to stand on. She found a discarded wooden crate, dragged it over to the wall, and carefully climbed onto it. She peered through the window, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The room inside was small and sparsely furnished, with a single table, a few chairs, and a bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Viridian was sitting at the table, facing away from the window. Across from him sat another man, younger, with a nervous, fidgety demeanor. Rose couldn't hear their conversation clearly, but she could make out a few words and phrases. They were discussing codes, messages, transmission, and interception. It became clear that the younger man was a cryptographer, someone skilled in the art of encoding and decoding secret messages. Rose realized that she had stumbled upon a clandestine operation, a network of spies and informants exchanging vital information about the war, or perhaps something even more sinister. The cryptographer seemed to be having second thoughts, expressing concerns about the legality and morality of their activities. Viridian, however, was insistent, his voice cold and menacing. "You have a duty," Rose heard him say. "A duty to your country, to your superiors. You will follow orders, or you will face the consequences." The cryptographer looked terrified, his hands trembling as he shuffled through a stack of papers. He seemed to be caught in a dilemma, torn between his conscience and his fear of reprisal. Rose felt a surge of empathy for the young man. She knew what it was like to be caught between duty and personal conviction, to be forced to make impossible choices. She remembered Thomas's words, his warning about the shadowy figure who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. She watched as Viridian handed the cryptographer a small, sealed envelope, similar to the one he had received at the hotel. "This message must be decoded immediately," he said. "It contains vital information that could change the course of the war. And it is imperative it does not fall into enemy hands, or the wrong hands within our own ranks." The cryptographer nodded nervously, taking the envelope with trembling hands. He began to work, his fingers flying across the pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. Rose knew that she had to do something, to intervene, to help this young man escape from Viridian's clutches. But she didn't know how. She was outnumbered, outmatched, and unarmed. She watched in frustration as the cryptographer continued to work, his face pale and drawn, his eyes darting nervously towards the door. He seemed to be looking for an escape, a way out of this dangerous situation. Suddenly, he stopped working. He looked up at Viridian, his expression one of defiance. "I can't do this," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "I won't be a part of this any longer. This is wrong. This is treason." Viridian's eyes narrowed, his face hardening into a mask of fury. He stood up, his hand reaching inside his jacket, as if reaching for a weapon. Rose knew that she had to act quickly, to save the cryptographer's life. She looked around desperately, searching for something to use as a distraction, a way to disrupt the meeting. Her hand was still on the window. The glass was old, brittle. She took a deep breath. It was now or never. With all her strength, she struck it with her elbow. Chapter 9. A Dance with Deception. The window shattered with a loud crash, sending shards of glass flying in all directions. The cryptographer jumped up in alarm, knocking over his chair. Viridian spun around, his hand still inside his jacket, his eyes blazing with anger. Rose, startled by the force of the impact and the sudden chaos, lost her balance and tumbled off the crate, landing hard on the cobblestone pavement. She felt a sharp pain in her ankle, but she ignored it, scrambling to her feet, ready to flee. Viridian rushed to the door, flinging it open, his gaze sweeping the alleyway. He saw Rose, her face illuminated by the dim light from the room, her eyes wide with fear and determination. "You," he snarled, his voice filled with rage. "You've been following me." He lunged towards her, his hand reaching out to grab her. Rose dodged his grasp, turning and running back towards the street, her injured ankle throbbing with pain. She heard him pursuing her, his heavy footsteps echoing behind her. She knew that she couldn't outrun him, not in her condition. She needed to find a way to lose him, to disappear into the crowd. She reached the street, the bright lights and bustling activity a stark contrast to the darkness and silence of the alley. She saw a group of people gathered outside a nearby restaurant, waiting for a table. She darted into the crowd, hoping to blend in, to become invisible. Viridian emerged from the alley, his gaze scanning the street, searching for her. He spotted her, just as she was about to disappear into the restaurant. "Stop her," he shouted, pointing at Rose. "She's a spy." The people in the crowd turned to look at her, their expressions a mixture of confusion and alarm. Rose knew that she had to act quickly, to convince them that she was not a threat. She stopped running, turned to face Viridian, and forced herself to smile. "This man is delusional," she said, her voice loud and clear, projecting an air of calm confidence that she didn't feel. "He's been harassing me all evening. I think he's had too much to drink." She turned to the crowd, appealing to their sense of reason and decency. "I'm just a widow, trying to enjoy a quiet evening. I don't know what his problem is." The people in the crowd hesitated, unsure who to believe. Viridian, his face flushed with anger, struggled to find words. "She's lying," he sputtered. "She's been spying on me. She broke into my office." Rose seized the opportunity to turn the tables on him. "My dear sir," she said with exaggerated politeness, "I think you're confusing me with someone else. I've never seen you before in my life. Perhaps you should go home and sleep it off." She turned to the crowd again, giving them a reassuring smile. "I apologize for the disturbance. Please enjoy your evening." She turned and walked into the restaurant, her head held high, her heart pounding in her chest. She found an empty table in a secluded corner and sat down, trying to calm her racing pulse. She had managed to escape Viridian, for the moment, but she knew that he wouldn't give up easily. He was a dangerous man, with powerful connections. She had made an enemy, and she had to be prepared for the consequences. She looked around the restaurant, her gaze sweeping the room, searching for any sign of him. She saw a few familiar faces, people she recognized from the Washington social scene. She nodded politely to a few acquaintances, but avoided making eye contact, not wanting to draw attention to herself. She ordered a glass of wine, hoping to calm her nerves. She needed to think, to plan her next move. She had learned a valuable lesson tonight. Viridian was not just a shadowy figure. He was a real person, with a network of operatives, engaged in clandestine activities that threatened the very foundations of democracy. She thought about the cryptographer, the young man who had risked his life to defy Viridian. She hoped that he had managed to escape, that he was safe. She felt a sense of responsibility for him, a need to protect him from harm. She finished her wine, paid her bill, and left the restaurant, her senses on high alert. She knew that she was walking a tightrope, balancing between danger and discovery. She had to be careful, discreet, and resourceful. She was playing a dangerous game, a dance with deception, and one wrong step could cost her everything. She hailed a cab, giving the driver the address to her home in a hushed voice, double-checking the street before stepping inside. It would be a sleepless night. She knew Viridian would not give up so easily. And she was right. As she stepped into the cab, she caught a glimpse of a familiar figure standing across the street, watching her, his face a mask of cold fury. The game was far from over. Chapter 10. The Stolen Locket. Rose arrived home to find the house eerily silent. The servants had retired for the night, leaving only the faint glow of the hallway lamps to illuminate the grand, empty rooms. She felt a sense of unease, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, as if she were being watched. She checked the locks on the doors and windows, ensuring that everything was secure. She knew that Viridian was capable of anything, and she wouldn't put it past him to try to break into her home. She went upstairs to her bedroom, her injured ankle throbbing with pain. She changed into a nightgown, washed her face, and sat down on the edge of her bed, trying to collect her thoughts. She reached for the small, silver locket that she always wore, the one containing the miniature portraits of herself and Thomas. It was her talisman, her connection to the past, a source of comfort and strength. But the locket was gone. Rose's heart skipped a beat. She frantically searched her neck, her clothes, the bedsheets, her dressing table. But the locket was nowhere to be found. Panic set in. The locket was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of her love for Thomas, a tangible reminder of the life they had shared, the promises they had made. It was irreplaceable. She remembered the struggle in the alley, the fall she had taken. Had the locket come loose then? Had Viridian picked it up? Or had she lost it somewhere else? She tried to retrace her steps, to visualize every moment of the evening. The hotel, the alley, the restaurant, the taxi ride home. She couldn't remember exactly when she had last seen the locket. The loss of the locket felt like a violation, a personal attack. It was as if Viridian had reached into her heart and stolen a piece of her soul. She felt a surge of anger, a renewed determination to fight back. She wouldn't let him win. She wouldn't let him destroy everything she held dear. She knew that finding the locket would be a long shot. But she had to try. It was a clue, a potential link to Viridian, a way to track him down. She decided to start by revisiting the alleyway, the scene of the confrontation. She knew it was risky, but she couldn't think of any other option. She changed back into her clothes, grabbed a flashlight, and slipped out of the house unnoticed. She took a taxi back to Georgetown, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The alleyway was deserted, shrouded in darkness. The air was cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of decay. Rose shone her flashlight around, her eyes scanning the cobblestone pavement, searching for any sign of the locket. She found nothing. She searched the area where she had fallen, the spot where the crate had been, the doorway of the building where Viridian had met the cryptographer. Still nothing. Frustration and despair began to creep in. She had lost the locket, and with it, perhaps her last chance to find Viridian and uncover the truth about Thomas's disappearance. As she was about to give up, she noticed something glinting in the darkness, near the base of the wall. She bent down, her heart skipping a beat. It was a small, silver chain broken in two. It was the chain from her locket. Rose picked it up, her fingers trembling. The chain was empty. The locket itself was gone. But the broken chain was a sign, a confirmation that she had lost it here, in the alley. She looked around, her eyes searching for any other clues. And then she saw it, a small, faint scuff mark on the wall, near the doorway. It looked like someone had scraped their shoe against the brick, leaving a trace of leather or rubber. Rose examined the scuff mark closely. It was fresh, recent. It hadn't been there earlier, when she had first entered the alley. She realized that Viridian must have picked up the locket after she had fled. He had probably noticed it glinting on the ground, and he had taken it as a trophy, a souvenir of his encounter with her. The scuff mark was a clue, a potential lead. It suggested that Viridian had been wearing a particular type of shoe, perhaps a boot with a distinctive sole. If she could identify the type of shoe, she might be able to track him down. She took out a small notebook and pencil from her purse and carefully sketched the scuff mark, noting its size, shape, and any distinguishing features. She would need to consult with someone who had expertise in footwear, perhaps a shoemaker or a cobbler. She left the alley, feeling a renewed sense of hope. She had lost the locket, but she had found something else, a clue that might lead her closer to Viridian. She knew that she was playing a dangerous game, but she was determined to continue. She had to find the locket, and she had to uncover the truth about Thomas's disappearance, no matter the cost. She hailed another cab and returned to the safety of her home, clutching the broken chain, a tangible reminder of her loss and a symbol of her unwavering determination. The scuff mark sketch was tucked safely in her purse, a new piece of the puzzle, a new avenue to explore. She felt exhausted but, strangely, exhilarated. The game was still on. Chapter 11. Letters from the Lost. The next morning, Rose awoke feeling exhausted but resolute. The loss of the locket still stung, but the discovery of the scuff mark had given her a new focus, a renewed sense of purpose. She knew she needed to act quickly, before Viridian had a chance to disappear again. She decided to start by consulting with a local shoemaker, a man named Mr. Abernathy, who had a small shop in Georgetown, not far from her home. Mr. Abernathy was known for his expertise in footwear, his ability to identify any shoe, any boot, from just a fragment of leather or a scuff mark on a wall. Rose dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant outfit, hoping to project an air of authority and credibility. She took the sketch of the scuff mark with her, along with the broken chain from her locket, as a tangible reminder of her loss. Mr. Abernathy's shop was a small, cluttered space, filled with the smell of leather and polish. Shelves lined the walls, stacked high with shoes of all shapes and sizes. Tools of the trade lay scattered across a workbench, along with scraps of leather, pieces of rubber, and half-finished boots. Mr. Abernathy himself was a small, wiry man with a weathered face, sharp eyes, and hands that were stained with years of working with leather. He greeted Rose with a polite nod, his gaze curious and appraising. Rose explained her situation, showing him the sketch of the scuff mark and the broken chain. She told him that she was trying to identify the type of shoe that had made the mark, and that it was a matter of great personal importance. Mr. Abernathy examined the sketch carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. He took out a magnifying glass, studying the details of the mark, the shape, the texture, the faint traces of stitching. "This is a military boot," he said finally, his voice firm and confident. "A high-quality, Custom-made boot, not the standard issue. See the stitching here? And the type of leather? This is expensive stuff. Rose's heart skipped a beat. A military boot. It confirmed her suspicion that Viridian was connected to the military, perhaps even a high-ranking officer. Can you tell me anything more about the boot? She asked, her voice eager. The manufacturer, perhaps? Or the specific style? Mr. Abernathy hesitated. I can't say for sure, he said. But it looks like a boot made by Henderson Sons, a British company that specializes in military footwear. They have a contract with the American Army, supplying boots to officers. Rose felt a surge of excitement. Henderson Sons. It was a lead, a tangible connection to Viridian. She knew that tracking down the specific boot would be difficult, but it was a start. Thank you, Mr. Abernathy, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. You've been very helpful. She paid him for his time and left the shop, her mind racing with possibilities. She decided to contact Henderson Sons to inquire about their sales records to see if she could find any information about Viridian. She knew that it would be a long shot. The company was based in London, and she would have to deal with bureaucratic red tape, privacy concerns, and the reluctance of officials to release sensitive information. But she had an idea. She remembered that Thomas had a cousin, Edward Sinclair, who lived in London. Edward was a lawyer with connections to the British government and the military establishment. Perhaps he could help her navigate the complexities of the British bureaucracy, gain access to the information she needed. She returned home and immediately wrote a letter to Edward, explaining her situation, her suspicions about Viridian, and her need for his assistance. She included a copy of the sketch of the scuff mark and a detailed description of the boot, as provided by Mr. Abernathy. She sealed the letter, addressed it to Edward's London address, and posted it, hoping that it would reach him quickly and that he would be willing to help. While she waited for a response from Edward, she decided to revisit Thomas's letters, the ones he had written to her from the front. She had read them countless times, but she felt that there might be something she had missed, a hidden clue, a subtle hint that could shed light on Viridian and his connection to Thomas. She retrieved the leather box from the desk drawer, took out the bundle of letters, and sat down by the fire, the warmth of the flames a small comfort in the face of the chilling mystery she was trying to unravel. She reread the letters one by one, her eyes scanning every word, every sentence, searching for any reference to Viridian, any mention of suspicious activities, any hint of the conspiracy that Thomas had uncovered. And then she found it. In a letter dated September 15, 1918, just a month before he had been reported missing, Thomas had written about a new officer who had arrived at his unit, a man named Major V. He described him as cold, calculating, and untrustworthy. He seems to be more interested in gathering intelligence than in fighting the enemy, Thomas had written. He asks a lot of questions, probes into matters that are none of his concern. I have a bad feeling about him, Rose. I think he's up to something. Rose's heart pounded in her chest. Major V. It was a clear reference to Viridian. Thomas had suspected him, even before he had known his full name. She continued to read, her eyes scanning the page, searching for more information. And then she saw it, a small, almost imperceptible smudge of ink, at the bottom of the page. It looked like Thomas had accidentally touched the ink before it had dried, leaving a faint, blurred mark. Rose examined the smudge closely. It was too small and blurred to be a letter or a number, but it looked familiar somehow. She took out a magnifying glass, studying the smudge under the amplified light. And then she realized what it was. It was a partial fingerprint. Rose felt a surge of excitement. A fingerprint. It was a tangible link to Thomas, a piece of his physical presence, preserved in ink. And it might also be a clue to Viridian's identity. She knew that fingerprint analysis was a relatively new science in 1923, but it was gaining acceptance as a forensic tool. If she could find someone who had expertise in fingerprint identification, she might be able to compare the smudge to known fingerprints, perhaps even identify Viridian. The letters, once a source of comfort and memory, had now yielded two crucial clues: the reference to Major V and the partial fingerprint. Rose felt a renewed sense of hope, a growing conviction that she was on the right track. The past was speaking to her, guiding her, revealing its secrets one by one. She closed the letters, the weight of Thomas's words and the faint trace of his touch lingering in the air. A new avenue had opened, a new challenge to pursue. The fingerprint. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. And she would follow it, wherever it might lead. Chapter 12. The Price of Silence. Finding a fingerprint expert in 1923 Washington, D.C. proved to be more challenging than Rose had anticipated. The science of fingerprint identification was still in its infancy, and most law enforcement agencies were only beginning to adopt it as a forensic tool. Rose spent several days making inquiries, contacting the police department, the Bureau of Investigation, the precursor to the FBI, and various private detective agencies. But she met with resistance, skepticism, and outright disbelief. Most of the officials she spoke to dismissed her request as frivolous, a waste of time. They told her that fingerprint analysis was unreliable, that it was impossible to identify someone from a partial, smudged print, especially one that was 5 years old. Rose was frustrated, but undeterred. She knew that the fingerprint was a crucial clue, a potential link to Viridian, and she wouldn't give up easily. She finally found a lead, a former police detective named Arthur Davies, who had retired from the force and now worked as a private consultant, specializing in unconventional investigations. Davies had a reputation for being eccentric, unorthodox, and fiercely independent, but he was also known for his expertise in fingerprint analysis, having studied the methods of the pioneering British fingerprint expert, Sir Francis Galton. Rose contacted Davies, arranging a meeting at his small, cluttered office in a run-down building on the outskirts of the city. Davies was a gruff, no-nonsense man with a keen eye and a skeptical demeanor. He listened to Rose's story, examined the partial fingerprint under a magnifying glass, and asked a series of probing questions. "This is a long shot, Mrs. Caldwell," he said finally, his voice gravelly. "A very long shot. The print is smudged, incomplete, and old. It's unlikely that we'll be able to make a positive identification. But it's possible?" Rose asked, her voice hopeful. Davies hesitated.
"Possible, yes," he said.
"But highly improbable. And it will be expensive. I charge a substantial fee for my services." Rose didn't flinch. She was prepared to pay whatever it took. She had inherited a considerable sum from her parents, and she was willing to use it to uncover the truth about Thomas's disappearance. "I understand," she said. "I'm willing to pay your fee. I just need to know if it's possible to identify the person who left this fingerprint." Davies studied her for a moment, his gaze piercing. He seemed to be assessing her determination, her sincerity. "All right, Mrs. Caldwell," he said finally. "I'll take the case. But I make no promises. This is a cold trail, and the odds are stacked against us." Rose felt a surge of relief. She had found someone who was willing to help her, someone who believed in the possibility of finding answers, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Davies explained his methods. He would need to compare the partial fingerprint to known fingerprints, searching for a match. He would start by checking the fingerprint records of the military, focusing on officers who had served in the vicinity of Ypres during the war. He also suggested that Rose try to obtain a full set of Viridian's fingerprints, if possible. It would greatly increase the chances of making a positive identification. Rose knew that obtaining Viridian's fingerprints would be a dangerous and difficult task, but she was willing to take the risk. She had come too far to turn back now. Davies gave her a list of supplies he would need, including specialized powders, brushes, and lifting tape. He also gave her instructions on how to handle the fingerprint evidence to avoid contaminating it or damaging it further. Rose left Davies' office, feeling a renewed sense of hope, but also a growing sense of apprehension. She was stepping deeper and deeper into a world of danger and intrigue, a world where the stakes were high and the consequences could be deadly. She returned home, determined to continue her investigation, to follow every lead, to pursue every clue until she had uncovered the truth. That evening, as she was preparing for bed, she received a phone call. It was a man's voice, unfamiliar, distorted, as if he were speaking through a handkerchief. "Mrs. Caldwell," the voice said, low and menacing. "I advise you to stop your inquiries. You are meddling in affairs that do not concern you. You are playing with fire. Rose's heart pounded in her chest. She recognized the threat, the veiled warning. It was Viridian or someone working for him. Who is this? She demanded, her voice trembling but firm. The voice chuckled, a cold, chilling sound. Let's just say I'm a friend of Major V. And I'm telling you, for your own good, to back off. Some secrets are best left buried. I'm not afraid of you, Rose said, her voice defiant, though her knees were shaking. I won't stop until I find the truth. The voice laughed again, a mocking, derisive sound. Then you are a fool, Mrs. Caldwell. A foolish, meddling widow. And you will pay the price for your interference. The price of silence is often death. The line went dead. Rose stood there, frozen, the phone clutched in her hand, the chilling words echoing in her ears. She had been warned. Viridian knew about her investigation, and he was prepared to silence her, by any means necessary. She felt a surge of fear, but also a renewed sense of determination. She wouldn't be intimidated. She wouldn't be silenced. She would continue her quest, no matter the cost. She had promised Thomas, and she would not break her vow. The threat, the chilling warning, had only strengthened her resolve. She was playing a dangerous game, but she was not alone. She had Davies, she had Edward hopefully, and she had the memory of Thomas to guide her. She would not back down. She would not be silenced. She would find the truth, even if it cost her her life. The voice on the phone had made one mistake. It had underestimated her. Chapter 13. Betrayal at Dawn. The threat on the phone had shaken Rose, but it had also steeled her resolve. She knew she was walking a dangerous path, but she couldn't turn back. She had to find Viridian, uncover the truth about Thomas's disappearance, and bring him to justice. She decided to focus on obtaining Viridian's fingerprints, as Davies had suggested. It was a long shot, but it was the best lead she had. She knew that Viridian frequented the Hotel Lafayette, and that he had a room there, room 312. She decided to try to gain access to the room, to search for any objects that might bear his fingerprints. It was a risky plan, bordering on reckless. But Rose felt she had no other choice. She had to take the initiative, to confront Viridian on his own turf. She devised a plan. She would pose as a cleaning lady, gaining access to the hotel's staff entrance and using her knowledge of the building's layout to reach room 312. She knew it was a long shot, but she had to try. She spent the next day preparing for her mission. She purchased a cleaning lady's uniform, a simple gray dress and apron, from a second-hand store. She practiced her disguise, adopting a stooped posture, a weary expression, and a shuffling gait. She also studied the layout of the Hotel Lafayette, using information she had gathered during her previous visit. She knew the location of the staff entrance, the service elevators, and the back stairways. She memorized the floor plan, the room numbers, and the emergency exits. She knew that timing was crucial. She would have to enter the hotel during the early morning hours, when the staff was minimal and the guests were still asleep. She would have to be quick, efficient, and discreet. She set her alarm for 4 a.m., a time when even the city that never sleeps was at its quietest. She dressed in her cleaning lady disguise, her heart pounding in her chest, her nerves on edge. She took a taxi to a street near the Hotel Lafayette and walked the remaining distance, her movements cautious and deliberate. She found the staff entrance, a nondescript door located at the rear of the building. She took a deep breath, steeled her nerves, and opened the door. She slipped inside unnoticed, her footsteps echoing in the dimly lit corridor. She found the service elevator, pressed the button for the third floor, and waited. The elevator arrived, its doors creaking open. She stepped inside, her heart racing, her senses on high alert. The elevator ascended slowly, stopping at each floor, its movements jerky and unpredictable. Rose held her breath, praying that no one would enter. Finally, the elevator reached the third floor. The doors opened, and Rose stepped out into a narrow corridor. She checked the room numbers, her eyes scanning the doors. She found room 312, at the end of the corridor. She approached the door cautiously, listening for any sounds from within. The room was silent. She took out a small set of lock-picking tools, the same ones she had used to open Harrison's safe. She inserted the tools into the lock, her fingers nimble and practiced. The lock clicked open. Rose took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, the air thick with the scent of stale cigar smoke. Rose closed the door behind her and turned on her flashlight, her beam illuminating the room. It was a standard hotel room, sparsely furnished, with a bed, a desk, a chair, and a small wardrobe. There were no personal belongings in sight, no signs of recent occupancy. Rose began her search, her eyes scanning every surface, every object, searching for anything that might bear Viridian's fingerprints. She checked the desk, the chair, the lamps, the doorknobs, the glasses on the bedside table. Nothing. She opened the wardrobe, finding it empty, except for a few wire hangers. She checked the drawers, finding them also empty. Frustration began to creep in. Had she been wrong? Was Viridian not staying in this room? Had he moved, or was he using a different alias? As she was about to give up, she noticed something on the floor, near the bed. A small, crumpled piece of paper. She picked it up, unfolding it carefully. It was a telegram, torn in half. Rose pieced the two halves together, her heart skipping a beat. The telegram was addressed to Monsieur Dubois, Hotel Lafayette, room 312. It was dated October 26, 1918, the day before Thomas had been reported missing. The message was brief, cryptic, but chilling. Operation Nightingale complete. Target eliminated. Await further instructions. Rose felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. Target eliminated. It was a clear reference to Thomas. Viridian had ordered his assassination. She heard a noise behind her, a faint creak of the floorboards. She spun around, her flashlight beam illuminating the doorway. Standing there, silhouetted against the light, was Harrison Caldwell, her husband. "Rose?" he said, his voice a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "What are you doing here?" Rose froze, her mind racing. She couldn't explain, couldn't reveal her true purpose. She had been caught, betrayed, by the one person she had thought she could trust. I was looking for you," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I couldn't sleep. I thought you might be here." Harrison frowned, his eyes narrowing. He didn't believe her. He stepped into the room, his gaze sweeping the scene, taking in the cleaning lady disguise, the flashlight, the torn telegram in her hand. "You've been lying to me, Rose," he said, his voice cold and accusing. "You've been investigating Thomas's death, haven't you? You've been digging into matters that are none of your concern." Rose didn't answer. She knew that the truth was out. Her secret was revealed. Harrison walked towards her, his expression menacing. "I warned you, Rose," he said. "I told you to let it go. But you wouldn't listen. And now you force my hand." He reached out, grabbing her arm, his grip tight and painful. Rose struggled to break free, but he was too strong. "What are you going to do?" she gasped, her voice filled with fear. Harrison smiled, a cruel, chilling smile. "I'm going to silence you, Rose," he said. "Just like I silenced Thomas." Rose's blood ran cold. Harrison. It had been Harrison all along. He was Viridian. He was the shadowy figure that Thomas had warned her about. He had orchestrated Thomas's death, and now he was going to kill her too. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound, the realization shattering everything she thought she knew. Dawn was breaking, the first rays of light filtering through the curtains, illuminating the room in a pale, ethereal glow. But for Rose, it was the darkest hour, the moment of ultimate betrayal, the end of her quest for truth. Chapter 14. The Rendezvous Point. Rose stared at Harrison, her mind reeling, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of his betrayal. He was Viridian. He had murdered Thomas. He was going to kill her. "Why, Harrison?" she gasped, her voice choked with emotion. "Why did you do it?" Harrison's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "Thomas was a threat," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "He knew too much. He was going to expose us." "Expose who?" Rose demanded. Expose what? The conspiracy, Harrison said, his voice low and menacing. The network. We couldn't allow him to interfere. He explained, in chilling detail, how he had been involved in a clandestine operation during the war, a network of powerful individuals, both American and French, who were manipulating events for their own personal gain. They were profiting from the war, selling arms, trading secrets, and prolonging the conflict for as long as possible. Thomas had stumbled upon their activities, uncovered their secrets, and threatened to expose them to the authorities. Harrison, as the leader of the network, had ordered his assassination, making it look like a battlefield casualty. It was a necessary sacrifice, Harrison said, his voice devoid of any remorse. For the greater good. For the preservation of our power, our influence, our wealth. Rose felt a surge of rage, a burning hatred for this man, this monster who had destroyed her life, who had murdered the man she loved. You're a monster, Harrison, she said, her voice trembling with fury. A cold-blooded killer. You'll pay for what you've done. Harrison chuckled, a mocking, derisive sound. You're in no position to threaten me, Rose, he said. You're trapped. You have no one to turn to. You're going to disappear, just like Thomas. And no one will ever know the truth. He tightened his grip on her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. He pulled her towards the window, his intention clear. He was going to throw her out, make it look like an accident, a suicide. Rose struggled, fighting with all her strength, but he was too powerful. She knew that she had to do something, to find a way to escape, to expose his crimes. She remembered the telegram, the one she had found on the floor, the one that confirmed Harrison's involvement in Thomas's murder. She had tucked it into her apron pocket before Harrison had arrived. It was her only hope, her only piece of evidence. She had to get it to someone who could expose Harrison and his network. She thought of Arthur Davies, the fingerprint expert. He was the only one she could trust, the only one who believed her, the only one who could help her. She had to get a message to Davies, to tell him about Harrison, to give him the telegram. But how? She saw a telephone on the desk near the window. It was her only chance. As Harrison dragged her towards the window, she pretended to stumble, losing her balance. She fell against the desk, knocking over the telephone, sending it crashing to the floor. Clumsy fool, Harrison snarled, his grip tightening. Rose saw her opportunity. As Harrison bent down to pick up the telephone, she reached into her apron pocket, grabbed the telegram, and slipped it under the telephone, out of sight. Let's get this over with, Harrison said, straightening up, his eyes filled with a cold, murderous intent. He dragged her towards the window again, his grip unrelenting. Rose knew that this was her last chance. She had to fight, to scream, to alert someone, anyone. She opened her mouth to scream, but before she could utter a sound, she heard a voice, a familiar voice, calling out from the hallway. Rose? Rose, are you in there? It was Edward Sinclair, Thomas's cousin. Harrison froze, his eyes widening in surprise and alarm. He released his grip on Rose, turning towards the door. What the? He muttered. Edward burst into the room, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. He saw Rose, her face pale and terrified, her cleaning lady disguise askew. He saw Harrison, his face flushed with anger, his posture threatening. What's going on here? Edward demanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. Rose seized the opportunity. He's trying to kill me, Edward,
she cried.
He's Viridian. He murdered Thomas. Edward's eyes widened in disbelief. He looked from Rose to Harrison, his mind struggling to comprehend the situation. Harrison? He said, his voice incredulous. Is this true? Harrison, realizing that he had been exposed, that his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, lost his composure. He lunged towards Edward, his fists clenched, his face contorted with rage. You traitor! He screamed. You'll pay for this. Edward, a younger and stronger man than Harrison, easily deflected his attack. He grabbed Harrison's wrists, twisting his arms behind his back, immobilizing him. I don't know what's going on here, Harrison, Edward said, his voice cold and firm. "But I'm taking you to the authorities. You'll have a lot of explaining to do." Rose, weak with relief, slumped against the wall, her legs trembling. She had survived. Harrison had been exposed. The truth was out. Edward called the police, who arrived within minutes. Harrison was arrested, his protests and denials falling on deaf ears. The telegram, recovered from beneath the telephone, provided irrefutable evidence of his guilt. As Harrison was being led away in handcuffs, he looked at Rose, his eyes filled with hatred and defeat. "You may have won this battle, Rose," he said, his voice low and menacing. "But the war is far from over. The network is bigger than you think. They'll come after you. They'll silence you, just like they silenced Thomas." Rose didn't flinch. She met his gaze directly, her expression unwavering. "I'm not afraid of them, Harrison," she said. "I'll expose them all. I'll bring them to justice. For Thomas, and for all the others who have suffered because of your greed and your ambition." Edward had secured a room at a different hotel, insisting it be as far from the Lafayette as possible. He'd sent a message to Davies, instructing him to bring his equipment and meet them. It was there, under the dim light of a hotel room lamp, that Rose was about to hand over the most important piece of evidence she had. Chapter 15. Escape from Arlington. The aftermath of Harrison's arrest was a whirlwind of activity. Police, detectives, and government officials swarmed the Hotel Lafayette, questioning staff, searching rooms, and seizing documents. The news of the scandal broke quickly, spreading like wildfire through Washington's political circles and beyond. Rose, exhausted but vindicated, found herself at the center of the storm. She was hailed as a heroine, a courageous widow who had single-handedly exposed a vast conspiracy, a network of corruption that reached the highest levels of power. But she knew that the battle was far from over. Harrison's warning, his threat that the network would come after her, echoed in her mind. She was a target, a loose end, a threat to their power and their secrets. Edward Sinclair, proving to be a loyal and resourceful ally, insisted that Rose leave Washington immediately. He arranged for her to travel to a safe house, a secluded estate in the Virginia countryside, near Arlington, where she could hide from the network and await further developments. "You're not safe here, Rose," Edward said, his voice firm and urgent. "Harrison's associates are powerful and ruthless. They'll stop at nothing to silence you." Rose, still reeling from the shock of Harrison's betrayal and the near-death experience, reluctantly agreed. She knew that Edward was right. She was in danger, and she needed to disappear, at least for a while. Edward arranged for a discreet departure, using a private car and a trusted driver. He gave her a new identity, a false name and passport, to protect her from detection. "You'll be Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, a widow from Boston, visiting relatives in Virginia," Edward explained. "Don't use your real name, don't contact anyone you know, and don't trust anyone you don't have to." Rose nodded, her mind racing. She was entering a new phase of her life, a life on the run, a life of hiding and deception. She was no longer Rose Kensington, the wealthy Washington socialite. She was Eleanor Thompson, a ghost, a shadow, a woman with a secret past. The journey to the safe house was long and tense. Rose sat in the back seat of the car, her eyes constantly scanning the road, searching for any sign of pursuit. She felt like a fugitive, a hunted animal, her every move fraught with danger. The safe house itself was a large, isolated estate, surrounded by acres of woods and farmland. It was a beautiful, tranquil place, but Rose felt no sense of peace or security. She was a prisoner in her own life, trapped by fear and uncertainty. The estate was managed by a caretaker, a gruff, taciturn man named Mr. Jones, who had been vetted by Edward and was completely trustworthy. He provided Rose with food, supplies, and a secure environment, but he offered little in the way of companionship or comfort. Rose spent her days in isolation, pacing the rooms of the house, reading books, and staring out at the vast, empty landscape. She felt like a caged bird, her spirit yearning for freedom, for a return to her old life. But she knew that she couldn't go back. Not yet. She had to wait, to see what happened next, to see if the authorities could dismantle the network, to see if she could ever truly be safe again. She received occasional updates from Edward via coded messages delivered by Mr. Jones. He informed her that the investigation into the conspiracy was progressing, that several arrests had been made, and that the network was beginning to unravel. But he also warned her that the danger was still present, that some of Harrison's most powerful associates were still at large, and that they were actively searching for her. "They know you're the key witness, Rose," Edward wrote in one message. "They know you can expose them all. They won't rest until they've silenced you." Rose felt a renewed sense of fear, a chilling realization that her escape from Arlington was only a temporary reprieve. She was still a target, and the network was closing in. One evening, as she was sitting by the fire, reading a book, she heard a noise outside, a faint rustling in the bushes. She looked up, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw a shadow, a dark figure moving stealthily through the trees. It was a man, armed with a rifle, his face obscured by the darkness. Rose knew instantly that it was one of the network's assassins, sent to kill her. She jumped up, her instincts screaming at her to flee. She ran to the back door, fumbling with the lock, her hands trembling. She heard the sound of breaking glass, the shattering of a window. The assassin was inside the house. Rose burst out of the back door, running into the darkness, her lungs burning, her legs pumping. She ran towards the woods, hoping to find cover, to escape from her pursuer. She heard footsteps behind her, the heavy thud of boots on the ground. The assassin was gaining on her. She stumbled, falling to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked up, seeing the assassin looming over her, his rifle raised, his face a mask of cold, murderous intent. She closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable. She had failed. The network had won. But the shot never came. Instead, she heard a shout, a struggle, and the sound of bodies colliding. She opened her eyes, seeing a figure grappling with the assassin, wresting the rifle from his grasp. It was Mr. Jones, the caretaker. He had come to her rescue. Mr. Jones, a surprisingly strong and agile man, overpowered the assassin, disarming him and knocking him unconscious. He turned to Rose, his face grim but resolute. "We have to go, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice urgent.
"Now."
"They know where you are. This place is no longer safe." Rose nodded, her mind racing. She had been betrayed again, this time by someone she had thought she could trust. The safe house had been compromised. The network was everywhere. Mr. Jones led her to a hidden vehicle, an old, battered truck concealed beneath a tarpaulin in a nearby barn. He helped her into the truck, and they sped away, leaving the estate behind, disappearing into the night. The escape had been narrow, the betrayal shocking. But Rose was alive, and she was still free. The hunt, however, was far from over. She had to find a new sanctuary, a new way to fight back. The network was closing in, but she wouldn't give up. She would not be silenced. She would find a way to expose them all, no matter the cost. Chapter 16. The Widow's Confession. Mr. Jones drove through the night, navigating the back roads of Virginia, avoiding the main highways and towns. Rose sat beside him, silent and shaken, her mind reeling from the events of the past few hours. She had narrowly escaped death. Again. The network was relentless, their reach extending far beyond Washington. "Where are we going?" she asked finally, her voice trembling. "Somewhere safe," Mr. Jones replied, his voice gruff but reassuring. "Somewhere they won't find you." He explained that he had been suspicious of the safe house from the beginning, that he had sensed something was wrong. He had been monitoring the area, keeping a close watch on any suspicious activity. He had seen the assassin approaching the house, and he had acted quickly, saving Rose's life. He revealed that he was not just a caretaker, but a former intelligence operative, a veteran of the war, with connections to a network of his own, a network of patriots who were dedicated to fighting corruption and protecting the innocent. "We've been watching you, Mrs. Thompson," he said. "We know about Harrison Caldwell, about the conspiracy, about your efforts to expose them. We're here to help you." Rose felt a surge of relief, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. She was not alone. There were others who believed in her, who were willing to fight alongside her. Mr. Jones drove them to a small, secluded cabin deep in the woods, near the border of West Virginia. It was a rustic, primitive place, but it was safe, hidden from the world. "This is where you'll stay," Mr. Jones said, "until we can figure out our next move." Rose spent the next few days in the cabin, recovering from her ordeal, gathering her strength, and planning her next steps. Mr. Jones provided her with food, supplies, and updates on the situation. He informed her that the investigation into the conspiracy was intensifying, that more arrests had been made, and that the network was crumbling. But he also warned her that the danger was still present, that some of Harrison's most powerful associates were still at large, and that they were determined to silence her. Rose knew that she couldn't stay hidden forever. She had to find a way to expose the remaining members of the network, to bring them to justice, to ensure that they could never harm anyone again. She decided to take a bold step, a risky gamble that could either save her or destroy her. She decided to go public, to reveal everything she knew about the conspiracy, to tell her story to the world. She knew that it was a dangerous move, that it would make her an even bigger target. But she felt she had no other choice. She had to speak out, to expose the truth, to prevent others from suffering the same fate as Thomas. Mr. Jones helped her contact a trusted journalist, a woman named Sarah Miller, who worked for a major newspaper in New York City. Miller was known for her investigative reporting, her courage, and her integrity. Rose arranged a secret meeting with Miller at a secluded location in the countryside. She told Miller her story, revealing everything she knew about the conspiracy, about Harrison Caldwell, about Viridian, about Thomas's murder. Miller was shocked, but also intrigued. She listened intently, taking notes, asking questions, and verifying Rose's claims. She realized that this was the biggest story of her career, a story that could shake the foundations of American society. Miller agreed to publish Rose's story, to expose the conspiracy to the world. But she also warned her that it would be a dangerous undertaking, that the network would try to discredit her, to silence her, to destroy her reputation. Rose was prepared for the risks. She had nothing left to lose. She had lost her husband, her home, her life. She was willing to sacrifice everything to bring the truth to light. Miller spent several weeks investigating Rose's claims, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and corroborating her story. She uncovered a vast web of corruption, deceit, and murder, a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government and industry. Finally, the story broke. Miller's newspaper published a series of explosive articles, exposing the conspiracy, naming names, and revealing the full extent of the network's crimes. The public reaction was one of outrage and disbelief. The scandal rocked the nation, leading to investigations, indictments, and arrests. The network was shattered, its members exposed and disgraced. Rose, hailed as a heroine, a courageous whistleblower, testified before Congress, providing damning evidence against Harrison Caldwell and his associates. Her testimony led to the conviction of dozens of individuals, including high-ranking government officials, military officers, and business executives. But the victory was bittersweet. Thomas was gone, and nothing could bring him back. Rose had avenged his death, exposed his killers, but the pain of his loss remained, a constant ache in her heart. As the dust of the story settled, Rose decided she needed to confront someone else. Someone who was involved. Someone who had kept quiet. Harrison's first wife, Margaret. Rose sought her out. She had been living quietly, remarried, in a small New England town. Margaret greeted her cautiously, inviting her into a simple, yet elegant home. "I know why you're here," Margaret said, her voice calm but tinged with sadness. "You want to know about Harrison?" Rose nodded, her eyes searching Margaret's face.
"I need to understand," she said. "How could he do it? How could he be so evil?"
Margaret sighed, her gaze drifting towards a window, overlooking a peaceful garden. "Harrison was always ambitious," she said. "Driven. He wanted power, wealth, influence. He would do anything to achieve his goals." She revealed that she had suspected Harrison's involvement in illegal activities during the war, but She had been too afraid to speak out. He had threatened her, intimidated her, and controlled her.
I was a prisoner in my own marriage, she said.
I lived in fear. I knew that if I crossed him, he would destroy me. She had divorced him after the war, escaping his clutches, but she had remained silent, fearing his retribution. She had carried the burden of his secrets for years, living with the guilt and the shame. Rose listened intently, her heart aching for this woman, this victim of Harrison's cruelty. She understood her fear, her silence. She had been there herself. I'm sorry, Rose, Margaret said, her voice filled with remorse. I should have spoken out sooner. I should have warned you. But I was too afraid. Rose reached out, taking Margaret's hand. It's not your fault, she said. You were a victim just like me. Just like Thomas. Margaret began to cry, tears streaming down her face. He was a good man, Thomas, she said. He didn't deserve to die. He was the only one who ever showed me any kindness. Rose felt a pang of jealousy, a flicker of resentment. But she pushed it aside. Margaret had suffered too. They were both victims of Harrison's evil. We have to move on, Margaret, Rose said. We have to find a way to heal, to rebuild our lives. We can't let Harrison's darkness consume us. They sat together for a long time, sharing their stories, their grief, their pain. They found solace in each other's company, a bond forged in shared trauma and a common enemy. The widow's confession had brought closure, a sense of understanding, a release from the burden of secrets. Rose had found an unexpected ally, a fellow survivor. They had both been wounded by Harrison's evil, but they were not broken. They would find a way to heal, to move on, to build a new life, free from the shadows of the past. The conversation gave her a measure of peace she hadn't expected. It was a chance to heal, to move on, to finally leave Harrison Caldwell behind. Chapter 17. Scars of the Somme. With the conspiracy exposed and Harrison Caldwell and his associates brought to justice, Rose felt a sense of closure, but also a profound emptiness. Thomas was gone, and nothing could bring him back. She had avenged his death, but the pain of his loss remained, a constant ache in her heart. She decided to leave the United States, to distance herself from the memories, the trauma, and the constant reminders of her past. She sold her Georgetown mansion, donated most of her belongings to charity, and booked passage on a ship bound for Europe. She had no clear destination in mind, no plan for the future. She just wanted to escape, to find a place where she could heal, where she could rebuild her life, where she could forget, or at least learn to live with, the pain of her loss. She traveled through Europe, wandering from country to country, city to city, seeking solace in the beauty of the landscape, the art, the culture, and the history. She visited museums, cathedrals, and ancient ruins, losing herself in the past, trying to escape the present. But the memories of Thomas followed her, haunting her dreams, intruding on her waking hours. She couldn't escape the pain, the grief, the constant ache of his absence. She found herself drawn to France, to the battlefields of the Somme, the place where Thomas had fought, the place where he had died. She felt a need to connect with him, to understand his experiences, to honor his sacrifice. She traveled to the Somme, to the small villages and towns that had been ravaged by the war. She walked through the fields, now green and peaceful, but once scarred by trenches, craters, and the bodies of fallen soldiers. She visited the cemeteries, the vast fields of white crosses, each one marking the grave of a soldier who had died in the war. She searched for Thomas's grave, but she knew that it was a futile quest. He had no grave. He was missing in action, presumed deceased. His body had never been recovered. She stood in the middle of a field, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, the echoes of the guns, the cries of the wounded. She felt a profound sense of sadness, of loss, of the futility of war. She closed her eyes, imagining Thomas, his face young and vibrant, his eyes full of life and hope. She remembered his smile, his laugh, his touch. She remembered their stolen moments, their whispered conversations, their passionate embraces. She felt his presence, a faint whisper in the wind, a gentle touch on her cheek. She knew that he was with her, in spirit, in memory, in the love that they had shared. She opened her eyes, seeing the world through a new lens, a lens of grief, but also of resilience, of hope, of the enduring power of love. She had lost Thomas, but she had also found herself. She had survived. She had overcome. She had emerged from the darkness stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. She decided to stay in France, to make a new life for herself, to dedicate herself to helping others, to honoring Thomas's memory by working for peace, for justice, for a world free from war and violence. She found a small village, near the Somme, that had been devastated by the war. She bought a small cottage, overlooking a peaceful valley, and began to rebuild her life. She volunteered at a local hospital, caring for the wounded, the sick, and the elderly. She used her wealth and her influence to support the community, to help rebuild the village, to provide education and opportunities for the children. She became known as Madame Rose, a kind, compassionate woman who had dedicated her life to serving others. She found solace in her work, in helping those who had suffered, in making a difference in the world. She never forgot Thomas. She kept his memory alive, sharing his stories, his letters, and his photographs with the people she met. She created a small memorial to him in her garden, a simple stone marker engraved with his name and the words "missing in action," presumed deceased. She often visited the memorial, sitting beside it, talking to Thomas, sharing her thoughts, her feelings, her hopes, and her dreams. She felt his presence, a comforting warmth, a silent reassurance that he was with her, always. One crisp autumn afternoon, as she was tending her garden, she heard a noise, a faint rustle in the leaves. She looked up, seeing a man standing at the edge of her property, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun. He was tall and slender, his hair streaked with gray, his face weathered and lined. He walked with a slight limp, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked somehow familiar. Her breath caught. Rose felt a strange sensation, a mixture of fear and anticipation. She stood up, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes fixed on the approaching figure. As he drew closer, she saw his face more clearly. His eyes, a familiar shade of hazel, met hers. Rose gasped, her breath catching in her throat. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But it was him. Thomas? She whispered, her voice trembling. The man smiled, a slow, hesitant smile. Rose, he said, his voice raspy and unfamiliar. It's me. Rose stood there, frozen, her mind reeling. Thomas was alive. He had survived. He had come back to her. The scars of the Somme were etched on his face, his body, but his eyes, those familiar hazel eyes, held the same warmth, the same love that she remembered. The impossible had happened. The past had returned. Chapter 18. The Unsent Letter. Rose stared at Thomas, her mind struggling to comprehend the reality of his presence. He was alive. He was here. After all these years, after all the pain and grief, after all the searching and the hoping, he had come back to her. They stood there for a long moment, gazing at each other, their eyes locked in a silent embrace. The years melted away, the pain and the loss fading into the background, replaced by a surge of overwhelming joy, of disbelief, of a love that had endured the ravages of time and war. Rose reached out, her hand trembling, touching his face, his cheek, his hair. She needed to feel him, to confirm that he was real, that he was not a ghost, a figment of her imagination. Thomas, she whispered again, her voice choked with emotion. It's really you. But how? How is this possible? Thomas smiled, a sad, weary smile. It's a long story, Rose, he said, his voice raspy and unfamiliar, the voice of a man who had seen too much, who had suffered too much. He explained, in halting words, how he had survived the explosion at Ypres, how he had been severely wounded, left for dead, and rescued by a French farmer and his family. He had been nursed back to health, slowly, painfully, over many months. He had lost his memory, his identity, his past. He had lived with a French family, working on their farm, hiding from the authorities, fearing that he would be captured and imprisoned as a deserter. He had lived a simple, quiet life, far from the war, far from the world he had known. He had adopted a new name, a new identity, a new life. He had tried to forget the past, to bury the memories, to escape the pain. But the memories had persisted, haunting his dreams, intruding on his waking hours. He had seen flashes of images, fragments of his past life, glimpses of a woman, a beautiful woman with auburn hair and hazel eyes. He had known somehow that he had to find her, that she was the key to his past, the key to his identity, the key to his future. He had begun to search, to investigate, to piece together the fragments of his memory. He had learned about the conspiracy, about Harrison Caldwell, about Viridian, about Rose's efforts to expose them. He had read the newspaper articles, seen Rose's photograph, recognized her face, her name, her story. He had known, instantly, that she was the woman from his dreams, the woman he had loved, the woman he had lost. He had traveled to France, to the Somme, seeking her, searching for her, guided by a faint hope, a desperate yearning, a love that had survived the ravages of war and time. Rose listened, her heart aching for him, for the suffering he had endured, for the years he had lost, for the life he had been denied.
"But why didn't you contact me?"
she asked, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you let me know you were alive?" Thomas hesitated, his gaze falling to the ground. "I was afraid, Rose," he said, his voice low and ashamed. "Afraid of what I had become, afraid of the memories, afraid of facing the past. And I was afraid that you wouldn't want me back." He revealed he'd been following the news. He'd read about Harrison's trial, about Rose's testimony, everything. Rose reached out, taking his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "Thomas," she said, her voice filled with love and compassion. "I never stopped loving you. I never stopped searching for you. I never gave up hope." They embraced, their bodies clinging together, their tears mingling, their hearts reunited after years of separation and loss. Rose led him inside the cottage, to the warmth of the fire, to the comfort of her home. She made him tea, fed him, and tended to his wounds, both physical and emotional. They talked for hours, sharing their stories, their experiences, their pain, and their joy. They filled in the gaps, pieced together the fragments of their past, and began to build a new future, together. As they were talking, Thomas remembered something. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, worn, leather-bound book. "I found this among my belongings," he said, handing it to Rose. "It's a journal. I think it might be yours." Rose took the journal, her heart skipping a beat. She recognized it instantly. It was the journal she had given to Thomas before he had been deployed overseas. The one that had been in the suitcase, the one that had contained his letters and his secrets. She opened the journal, her fingers trembling. The pages were filled with her handwriting, her thoughts, her feelings, her memories of their time together. And then she saw it. Tucked inside the back cover of the journal was a letter. It was an unsent letter, addressed to Thomas, written by Rose, just days before he had been reported missing. She unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the words, her heart pounding in her chest. "My dearest Thomas, I write this letter with a heavy heart, knowing that you are facing danger, that you may not return. But I need you to know this. I love you, more than words can express. You have changed my life. You have awakened my spirit. You have given me a reason to live, to hope, to dream. I know that our time together has been brief, that our love has been forged in the crucible of war. But it is real, it is true, it is eternal. And no matter what happens, no matter where you are, no matter whether you live or die, I will always love you. I have made a decision. I will not marry Harrison. I will not live a life of lies, of pretense, of quiet desperation. I will wait for you, Thomas. I will wait for as long as it takes. And if you don't return, I will live my life honoring your memory, fighting for the causes you believed in, and cherishing the love that we shared. Yours always and forever." Rose finished reading the letter, tears streaming down her face. It was a declaration of her love, a testament to her devotion, a promise that she had kept, even in his absence. She looked at Thomas, his eyes filled with tears, his face reflecting the pain and the joy of their reunion. "I meant every word, Thomas," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I never stopped loving you. I never will." Thomas took her in his arms, holding her close, their hearts beating as one. They had found each other again, against all odds. They had survived the war, the conspiracy, the years of separation and loss. They had a second chance, a new beginning, a future filled with hope, with love, with the promise of a life together. The unsent letter, a message from the past, had brought them full circle, confirming the enduring power of their love, a love that had conquered time, distance, and even death itself. Chapter 19. A Promise Remembered. The days that followed were a blur of rediscovery, of healing, of rebuilding a life together that had been shattered by war and deceit. Rose and Thomas spent hours talking, sharing their experiences, their memories, their hopes, and their dreams. They explored the French countryside, visited the battlefields of the Somme, and paid their respects to the fallen soldiers. Thomas slowly began to recover his memory, his identity, his past. The fragments of his life before the explosion came back to him, piece by piece, like a jigsaw puzzle slowly taking shape. He remembered his childhood, his family, his education, his military training, and, most importantly, his love for Rose. He also remembered the conspiracy, the network, the details of Harrison Caldwell's crimes. He realized that he still possessed valuable information that could help bring down the remaining members of the network, those who had escaped justice. Rose and Thomas decided to return to the United States to confront the past, to testify before Congress, to ensure that all those responsible for the conspiracy were held accountable. They contacted Edward Sinclair, who had been instrumental in helping Rose expose Harrison Caldwell. Edward was overjoyed to hear that Thomas was alive, and he immediately made arrangements for their return, providing them with safe passage, legal representation, and protection. They arrived in Washington, D.C., under assumed names, and were immediately placed under protective custody. The news of Thomas's return sent shockwaves through the city, through the nation, and through the world. The media went into a frenzy, clamoring for interviews, for details, for the story of the miracle soldier who had come back from the dead. But Rose and Thomas remained silent, refusing to speak to the press, focusing on their mission, on bringing the remaining conspirators to justice. They met with investigators, prosecutors, and government officials, sharing their knowledge, their evidence, and their testimony. They provided crucial information that led to the arrest and indictment of several high-ranking individuals, including politicians, military officers, and business executives. Thomas's testimony was particularly damaging, as he had first-hand knowledge of the conspiracy, of Harrison Caldwell's role, and of the identities of the key players. He spoke with passion, with conviction, and with the authority of a man who had seen the horrors of war, who had suffered the consequences of greed and corruption. Rose stood by his side, supporting him, encouraging him, and providing him with the strength and the love he needed to face the ordeal. She was his rock, his anchor, his constant companion. The trials were long and arduous, filled with legal wrangling, political maneuvering, and media scrutiny. But Rose and Thomas persevered, determined to see justice done, to honor the memory of those who had died, and to prevent such a conspiracy from ever happening again. In the end, the remaining members of the network were convicted, sentenced to long prison terms, and stripped of their power and their wealth. The conspiracy was finally broken, its secrets exposed, its perpetrators brought to justice. Rose and Thomas, hailed as heroes, as symbols of courage and resilience, were finally free to live their lives, to rebuild their future, to embrace the love that had endured so much. They returned to France, to the small village near the Somme, to the cottage that Rose had made her home. They decided to stay there, to live a quiet, peaceful life, far from the spotlight, far from the memories of the past. They spent their days tending their garden, walking through the fields, and visiting the local hospital, where they volunteered their time and their resources. They became active members of the community, helping those in need, supporting local charities, and working for peace and reconciliation. They never forgot the war, the suffering, the loss. They continued to honor the memory of the fallen soldiers, visiting the cemeteries, attending memorial services, and speaking out against war and violence. One day, when back at the cottage, Thomas found something that had eluded him. Tucked in a compartment in the suitcase he'd left Rose, he discovered a small velvet box. Inside was a ring. It was a simple band, a circle of intertwined gold and silver. He recognized it instantly. He'd purchased it in Paris, days before his deployment to Ypres. He'd meant to give it to Rose, to propose to her, to ask her to be his wife. But the war had intervened, the explosion had shattered his plans, and the ring had remained hidden, a forgotten promise, a symbol of a future that had never been. He took the ring to Rose, who was sitting in the garden, tending to her flowers. He knelt beside her, his heart filled with emotion. "Rose," he said, his voice trembling, "I have something to ask you." He showed her the ring, the small velvet box, the symbol of his love, of his commitment, of his promise. Rose looked at the ring, her eyes widening in surprise and disbelief. She remembered the conversation they had had just before he had left for Ypres, about their future, about their dreams, about the possibility of marriage. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I don't know what to say." "Say yes, Rose," Thomas said, his eyes filled with love and hope. "Say you'll be my wife. Say you'll spend the rest of your life with me." Rose smiled, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Thomas," she said. "Yes, I will. I will marry you. I will spend the rest of my life with you." They embraced, their hearts overflowing with joy, with love, with the promise of a future together. The ring, a symbol of a forgotten promise, had finally found its rightful place on Rose's finger, a testament to their enduring love, a love that had survived war, betrayal, and years of separation. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. The wedding was a small, intimate affair, held in the village church near the Somme. Rose and Thomas invited only a few close friends and family, including Edward Sinclair, Mr. Jones, and Sarah Miller, the journalist who had helped expose the conspiracy. Rose wore a simple, elegant dress, made of white lace, and a small bouquet of wildflowers, gathered from her garden. Thomas wore a dark suit, his military medals pinned to his chest, a reminder of his service, his sacrifice, and his resilience. The ceremony was simple, but heartfelt. The village priest, a kind, elderly man who had known Rose for several years, officiated the wedding, speaking of love, of commitment, of the enduring power of the human spirit. Rose and Thomas exchanged vows, their voices filled with emotion, their eyes locked in a loving embrace. They promised to love each other, to cherish each other, to support each other through all the joys and sorrows of life. They exchanged rings, the simple gold and silver band that Thomas had kept hidden for so many years, finally finding its rightful place on Rose's finger. It was a symbol of their enduring love, a love that had survived war, betrayal, and years of separation. As they were pronounced husband and wife, the small congregation erupted in applause, cheers, and tears of joy. Rose and Thomas had finally found their happy ending, their long-awaited reunion, their promise fulfilled. After the ceremony, they held a small reception in the village square, sharing food, wine, and laughter with their friends and family. It was a celebration of love, of life, of the enduring power of hope. Rose and Thomas danced together, under the clear blue sky, their bodies swaying to the music, their hearts filled with joy. They had waited so long for this moment, this dance, this union. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the village, Rose and Thomas walked hand in hand, back to their cottage, to their home. They had a new life ahead of them, a future filled with love, with peace, with the promise of happiness. They sat together in their garden, watching the sunset, their hands intertwined, their hearts at peace. They had been through so much, suffered so much, lost so much. But they had found each other again, against all odds. "I love you, Rose," Thomas said, his voice filled with emotion. "I always have and I always will." "I love you too, Thomas," Rose replied, her voice equally filled with emotion. More than words can say. They embraced, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one. They had faced the darkness, the betrayal, the pain, and they had emerged victorious. Their love had endured, their spirit had triumphed, their promise had been fulfilled. They continued to live in the French countryside. They traveled. They made their home a place of refuge. Thomas eventually wrote about his experiences. The book became a success. But the money they earned went toward causes for veterans. Causes for peace. The years went on, and their hair turned fully silver, their bodies slowing. But the love, it never diminished. It deepened. It became the bedrock of their lives. They had reckoned with duty, with love, with loss, with betrayal. And, in the end, love had won. It had persevered. One peaceful evening, as they were sitting in their garden, watching the sunset, Thomas took Rose's hand, his grip gentle but firm. "Thank you, Rose," he said, his voice soft and filled with gratitude. "For never giving up on me. For finding me. For loving me." Rose smiled, her eyes filled with tears of joy. "Thank you, Thomas," she replied. "For coming back to me. For surviving. For loving me." They sat there, in silence, their hands intertwined, their hearts connected, their souls at peace. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple. The reckoning of love and duty had been long and arduous, filled with pain, with loss, with sacrifice. But in the end, love had prevailed. Their love had endured, their bond had strengthened, their promise had been fulfilled. They had found their happy ending, their peace, their sanctuary, in each other's arms. Epilogue. Years passed, turning into decades. Rose and Thomas lived a long and fulfilling life together in their French cottage, surrounded by the beauty of the countryside, the love of their friends, and the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. They became pillars of their small community, known for their kindness, their generosity, and their unwavering commitment to peace and justice. Their story became a legend, a testament to the enduring power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the triumph of good over evil. Journalists, historians, and filmmakers sought them out, eager to document their extraordinary lives, to share their story with the world. But Rose and Thomas always remained humble, modest, and fiercely protective of their privacy. They preferred to live a quiet life, far from the spotlight, cherishing their time together, grateful for every moment they had been given. They often walked through the fields of the Somme, visiting the cemeteries, paying their respects to the fallen soldiers, and remembering the horrors of war. They never forgot the past, the sacrifices that had been made, the lessons that had been learned. They continued to support veterans' causes, advocating for peace, and working to prevent future conflicts. They became symbols of hope, of reconciliation, of the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome adversity. Their cottage became a haven for those seeking solace, for those who had been wounded by war, for those who had lost loved ones, for those who needed a listening ear, a kind word, a helping hand. Rose and Thomas welcomed them all, sharing their stories, their wisdom, and their love. They created a community of healing, a place where broken hearts could mend, where lost souls could find their way, where the scars of the past could begin to fade. As they grew older, their bodies weakened, their steps slowed, but their love for each other remained as strong as ever. They had been through so much together, faced so many challenges, overcome so many obstacles. Their bond had been forged in the crucible of war, tempered by betrayal, and strengthened by years of shared experiences, of love, of devotion. One autumn evening, as the leaves were turning golden and the air was crisp and cool, Rose and Thomas sat together in their garden, watching the sunset, their hands intertwined, their hearts at peace. They had lived a long and full life, a life filled with love, with adventure, with purpose. They had made a difference in the world, touched countless lives, and left behind a legacy of courage, resilience, and hope. Rose, her hair now completely silver, her face etched with the lines of time, but her eyes still sparkling with the same hazel light, looked at Thomas, her beloved husband, her soulmate, her partner in life's journey. "We did it, Thomas," she said, her voice soft and filled with emotion.
"We survived.
"We found each other. We made a difference." Thomas, his hair also silver, his face weathered and lined, but his eyes still holding the same warmth, the same love, smiled at Rose, his grip tightening on her hand. "We did, Rose," he replied, his voice equally filled with emotion. "We did it together. And I wouldn't have had it any other way." They sat there, in silence, their hands clasped, their hearts connected, their souls intertwined. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a breathtaking display of colors. As the last rays of light faded, Rose leaned her head on Thomas's shoulder, closing her eyes, a peaceful smile gracing her lips. She had lived a long and extraordinary life, a life filled with love, with loss, with adventure, with purpose. She had found her true love, she had fought for justice, she had made a difference in the world. And now, she was ready to rest, to find peace, to join the countless souls who had gone before her. Thomas felt her body relax, her breathing slow, her hand go limp in his. He knew that she was gone, that her spirit had departed, that she had found her final peace. He sat there for a long time, holding her hand, his tears flowing freely, his heart aching with grief, but also filled with gratitude, with love, with the memory of a life well lived, a love that had endured, a promise that had been fulfilled. He knew that he would join her soon, that their souls would be reunited, that their love would continue to shine, a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a story that would be told for generations to come. He closed his eyes, the image of Rose, young and vibrant, smiling at him across a battlefield hospital, forever etched in his memory. He whispered her name, one last time, a promise of reunion, a final farewell.